Later.
Thanks, Alan. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we have Amy Angert, who's a professor of evolutionary, she's an evolutionary ecologist and professor at UBC, who also resides in Bellingham. She's going to talk today about shifting plant communities, how plants are tending to go towards higher elevations with global warming, but they're not all doing this at the same rate. And so you're seeing this sort of shift of community balance, new types of plant communities sort of forming. And she's studying that and looking at what the future of these plant communities might be as we go forward. Amy?
Thank you. Thank you guys for the invitation. I'm really delighted to share some work that we've been doing locally here in the Cascades. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Good. And you're seeing my slides? Excellent. Okay. Great. So I'm sure that many of you, when you're driving or hiking, have noticed that the species we see are often predictably determined by the climates of the places that we're traveling through. So as you move, say, from our lowland forests up in elevation and it gets cooler and the rain changes to snow and the growing seasons shorten, then you'll see over and over again this conversion of the plant species composition from things like our lowland, Doug firs and red cedars, all the way up into hemlocks and firs at our higher elevations. And so centuries of ecological studies have shown time and again that climate is one of the most important determinants of species distributions in space and in time. And we know that climate is changing rapidly, more rapidly now than at almost any time in the historical record. And it's not just a future problem or a somewhere else problem, it's literally happening here and now, and we can see it in data. I actually pulled some weather station records from here in Bellingham for the month of July, and you can see that the last decade of July temperatures have been well above their historical average right here already. And so if we take the simple fact that climate determines species distributions and climate is changing, then it's not hard to come to the conclusion that species distributions then must also be changing rapidly. And in fact, species are on the move. They are marching towards the poles and they're moving upslope in elevation. And these sorts of movements towards the poles and up to higher elevations are observed across many different plants and animals, many different parts of the world, and they form some of the best sort of consensus evidence that we have that climate change is already having effects on biodiversity. And it's as simple as this old saying, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, right? So species are fleeing the kitchen, they're fleeing to the poles and they're fleeing to higher elevations to get out of the heat. And if we sort of zoom in and think about what's actually causing these range shifts at the individual and population level, then they're simply the result of mortality and colonization. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So on this gradient, we're imagining an elevation gradient, and the temperature of the landscape is just sort of corresponding to a thermal gradient that you might see along elevation. And we're going to imagine that the climate is warming, right? And this gradient has shifted out from under these plants, right? And now at the low end of the species range, it's now become too hot. And so mortality will cause this lower range edge to contract upslope. But now at high elevations, places that used to be, say, too cold are now suitable. And so individuals can colonize and extend the upper range limit in a symmetrical fashion. So if these new colonizations balance the mortality that's happening at the lower end, then this range is just going to march inexorably upslope as climate warms. If only it were that simple, right? Then all we would have to do to predict the composition of our future forests would be to know how much it's warming, how sensitive species are to temperature, and boom, we could just predict that upward march. But there are a lot of complications. And because of the complications, it means that now we don't really have a good handle on which species are going to be able to keep up with that march and which are going to sort of get left behind. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the main complicating factors that we're trying to study and then how we're going to be tackling it. So the first complication is simply that births and deaths often lag behind climate changes. They don't happen as quickly as the climate is changing. So at the lower end of a range where it's become, say, too hot, it might take something like a tree a really long time to die. And these adult trees can be quite persistent for many, many decades. And so essentially, although these populations are mismatched to the climate, they're not gone yet. And so they're sort of forming these forests of the living dead under this hypothesis. And then at the other end of the range, colonization is actually quite limited. So it requires rare long distance movements through fragmented landscapes. Perhaps if a seed lands in this area, it might be missing a mutualist like a pollinator or microbes in the soil that would help it establish. And although I've depicted this landscape as if it were empty, there's other species there that might actually block colonization of these propagules that are landing in the area. And so what this means is that there's a mismatch between the distributions we see and the climatic tolerances of these individuals. Now, another complication is that landscapes are topographically complex, right? And there's places in these mountainous regions that are quite a lot less exposed to climate change than other places. So for example, down in coves, these sort of depressions in the landscape, cold air sinks and they're cooler and also less variable in their temperatures through time than say exposed ridgelines. And likewise, under the canopy of an old growth forest, it can be several degrees cooler than places that are out in the open where it's hotter and more variable. And so the idea here is that species, depending on where they reside in these microhabitats, might be more or less exposed to climate change that's happening at the regional level. And so species persisting in these microrefugia are essentially buffered from the effects of regional warming and therefore will show less rain change over time. They're not feeling the heat. And of course, climate change is more than just rising temperatures. We're calling it, instead of global warming, call it global weirding, or talk about it as climate change, because as the circulation patterns are shifting, they're having all sorts of other effects on our climate system, intensifying both ends of the water cycle. So we have bigger, wetter storms and bigger droughts in between, changing fire regimes, and on and on. So it's not just the warming that's happening. And species are sensitive to these other changing variables as well, and they might be changing in different directions and at different rates than temperature. So for example, here, imagine a species that's more sensitive to precipitation changes than temperature. And if the precipitation change is driving it down slope, then it might have mortality at the upper edge, it might have new colonizations at the lower edge. And so this is a climate-driven range shift, but just not in the intuitive direction, not upslope. So if we put all these things together and sort of summarize these complexities, these time lags in mortality and colonization means it's not just that they can't stand the heat, they need to leave the kitchen. They can't stand the heat, but they're not leaving the kitchen, at least not yet, right? These microrefugia, these nooks and crannies in the landscape that might provide thermal buffers mean that the species can't feel the heat. So why should they leave the kitchen? And then finally, with all of these other changes besides warming, you know, the kitchen's too hot, it's also on fire, the sink is overflowing, some species are rushing in to fix the sink, others are fleeing the fire, right? Everything's going in different directions. It's a multivariate problem. And so when all of this is happening at once, when we look at the real data on range shifts, we can see that they are highly variable. So let me orient you to this graph, and then I'll talk about the trends. So these are from surveys of almost 200 different plant species in the European Alps. And they were surveyed first in the 1970s and then again in around 2015. And so we're looking at about 45 years of change between the two surveys. And then they're asking, of all of these species, how many have shifted their lower range edge, their range center, their upper range edge, or the full extent of their range. And the width of these blobs is proportional to how many species have shown a certain amount of change, okay? So for example, you can see that there are some species that are shifting upwards quite a lot at the lower edge, they're moving upslope, and then other species that have moved quite far downslope at their lower edges. So species are moving in different directions. And we also see that most species haven't moved much at all, right? So the average across these 183 species tends to be above 0. So most species are moving up slope on average, but most species aren't moving very far, certainly not as fast as it's warming, and that many other species are growing seemingly in the wrong direction. But it's the slowness, the fact that most species aren't showing much shift at all, that I'm particularly interested in understanding and trying to figure out. Because on the one hand, if the slowness is caused by time lags, it takes a long time to die, it's really hard to colonize newly suitable areas, then it means that these communities are vulnerable. The species within them are mismatched to the current climate. And in the future, as the time lags catch up, as mortality happens, as colonization continues to be limited, then we will start to see more range contractions, and these species are vulnerable to the changes that are happening. But on the other hand, if most of the slowness is caused by buffering in these microrefugia, it means that species have places where they're sheltered. It means that the slow change actually signals a degree of resistance. And it means that the slow change is actually a signal that these species aren't at as much threat as we might think they would be, if as opposed to when the slow change is caused by these time lags. So in our ongoing work in the Cascades, we've been asking, how have our local plant communities changed over about 40 years? And spoiler alert, there's not much change. We're trying to figure out what explains the slow change. Is it mostly due to time lags? Is there a degree of buffering through topography and canopy that's providing some protection and sheltering these species from feeling the rising temperatures and changing climate? This is very much still a work in progress. I won't have all the answers today, but what I wanted to do is give you a sense of sort of how we're tackling these questions and the kind of work that's ongoing. It's also a fairly new study system to me, so most of my fieldwork has been on a different group of species in California. So I'm hoping to learn a lot from you guys about these species and their natural histories and what your observations have been in this area. I also want to point out this is a collaborative effort. My co-PI is Dr. Janneke Hille-Rees-Lambers, who until recently was at University of Washington, and she's just taken up a new position in Zurich, but we're still collaborating on this work, as well as a whole host of postdocs and grad students and undergraduates who've been involved in our field crews over the past several summers. I get to spend a lot more time in the field than I do, unfortunately. Okay, so in terms of how the plant communities have changed over the past about 4 decades, we're building on some historical vegetation surveys that were carried out at Mount Rainier, led up by Jerry Franklin, and then in the North Cascades complex, led by Dr. Jim Agee. And in the 70s into the early 80s, both of these guys led a team of folks who were trying to map the vegetation types, survey the forest communities in each of these parks. And we were really fortunate to be able to gain access to their records, their field notes, their original maps. And we were able to then go to all the places they went, replicating as nearly as we could their methods so that we could resurvey the same plots in the same way as they did back in the 70s. So here's just an overview of where the plots are in both of these parks. There's well over 400 plots in each of these parks. So it's taken us a few years to get to them all. It's taken a fair bit of backpacking and adventuring off trail to try to relocate them. But they're spanning these incredible climatic gradients and really the diversity of vegetation types in these 2 parks. So at each of those dots on the map, we establish a plot. It's shown here as a sort of overview map. So the outer plot is 500 square meters, a circular plot. And across that plot, we survey all of the trees and measure their diameter at breast height and their identity. And then in that smaller shaded subplot, that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, we're identifying all the juvenile trees and all of the understory vegetation and recording all the presence and absence of species in the 50-meter subplot. And in those 4 quadrats at each of the cardinal directions, we zoom in and actually estimate percent cover of all of the different understory species. And these are just some folks showing them, the field crew, setting up the plots and assembling the quadrats to make the measurements. And then as we go through, we spend a lot of time keying out each individual species, taking field notes on things like the microhabitat characteristics of the plot, measuring the trees. These lucky folks were backpacking into these amazing sites and measuring plants all day. So what could be better? never rained, there were never bugs, I'm sure. So today I'm just going to focus on a small piece of the data set. So this is the understory species in that 50-meter squared subplot. Only at North Cascades, we're still working up the data from Mount Rainier. And so we're focusing on these 42 species that span some ferns, some herbaceous forbs, and up into sort of woody shrubs and even sort of small trees like vine maple. And so here's one of our primary results. And it's graphed in the same design as that graph from the intro, only this time it's our data. So again, we have elevational change in meters from the original survey to our resurveys. We're looking at whether their low range edges have changed up or down, their range center, their upper range edge, or that difference in range size from low to high, okay? And again, the width of these blobs is showing you how many species have gone a certain distance, either upslope if it's positive or downslope if it's negative, right? And so the main point from this graph is simply that most of these data are hovering right around zero, right? So we're seeing even less change here than in the Alps over a pretty similar time span with similar functional groups and habitats and a pretty substantial amount of warming. So really a story of no change despite the changes around these species. You might be wondering, there are some outliers and there are some species who've been on the move. And so who are they? Well, if we sort of zoom in at these, a couple exemplar species that are showing quite a bit of change, one of the species that showed the largest shift upslope is actually the Devil's Club, and that's because of this incredible range contraction happening at its lower range limit. So this might not be too sad for most of you who've fought your way through stands of Devil's Club. But in the resurvey data shown in blue, it was much more prevalent at low elevations. And in our resurvey data, much less prevalent down low in this shifted sort of peak in abundance towards middle elevations over the last about 40 years. Now at the upper edge of its range, we see a big shift, relatively speaking, for salmonberry. So if you look here, there's not much change, no difference between the blue and the yellow lines down at low elevation. But at sort of mid to high elevations, you see that the yellow line for our resurvey data is pushed over to higher elevations than in the legacy data, which are in blue. So these are some uphill moves for Devil's Club and salmonberry. If we look at the other end, we see some species that are actually moving in a non-intuitive direction. They're moving downhill. And so one of those is this orchid, the rattlesnake plantain. And you can see from the historical data to the present data, it's shifted its lower elevation limit to even lower elevations without changing much at the top. And then the opposite happened for ocean spray here, where in the historical data, it was found at higher elevations, and we resurveyed and found it only down here at sort of somewhat lower elevations at its upper edge than in the legacy data. And these sorts of downslope movements were actually quite a bit more prevalent than upslope movements, quite surprisingly. So there's several other species that also showed these downslope movements like sword fern, princess pine, thimbleberries, starflowers. All of these are showing downslope shifts at either their upper or lower range edges. But again, these are the exceptions. Most species have hardly moved at all, right? So if we look at things like the Douglas maple or the lady fern, the historical and resurvey lines for their probability of being found across elevations are completely overlapping, right? There's really not much range shift happening anywhere across the distributions of any of these species. So this is really what we want to explain. What explains these slow rates of change for most species? And here's where I don't have the answers yet, but I'm going to tell you how we're sort of working on this right now. So remember, our first hypothesis was that these slow rates of change are really just time lags. It takes a long time for long-lived organisms to die, and colonization opportunities are quite limited, so that the climate is moving faster than these ranges can keep up. And so what we're doing is actually testing this hypothesis by moving the species ourselves. So what we're trying to do is say, if we put seeds out across this gradient, do the seeds recruit in the same places as the adults or not? And let me show you how that tells us about time lags. So in this graph, we're imagining elevation on the x-axis, just like we've been showing in all these graphs. And imagine the shaded block would be the elevation range of the adults, where they're persisting on the landscape today. All right. Now, if we put seeds out across this entire elevation gradient, and the seedlings can germinate and establish and recruit into these elevations, the same elevations as the adults, then we would have no evidence for time lags. The climate of the adults and the climate of the seedlings is the same. They're well matched. Okay. But on the other hand, if we put seeds out, and they can no longer recruit where we still have adults persisting, then that would tell us that there's just a time lag in mortality, and these adults are like a forest of the living dead. Okay. And on the other hand here, if we put seeds out and they can germinate and establish at higher elevations than we found the adults yet, then that would tell us there's a time lag in colonization, right? That's causing the species not to be recruiting in newly suitable habitats unless we actually physically move them there ourselves. Okay. And so we've had these seed addition experiments ongoing for a couple of years now, and we're working on 2 transects. One is a west transect going from on the wet side of the mountains from Glacier up towards Heliotrope Ridge, and the other's on the dry side starting near Mazama and going up towards Rainy Lake. And on each of these transects, we have a whole host of about 14 sites on each transect. Every couple hundred meters, we've established a new site. So we're spanning the elevation gradient for all of these species. And then within each site, we have this sort of design. Ignore the trees for now, I'll talk about that in a moment. But we have all these different plots. And in each plot, we have a control where we just let the background vegetation be. And then an addition side where we put a seed mix out that has about 25 different species, a whole range of functional types and different species that we've been resurveying. And then we're monitoring what happens to them. So here's just a picture of some of the plots where we see the plots are here marked with the flagging at the corners. And there were so many things germinating, we had to try to divide it into subplots to count them all. And every time we find a seedling of our focal species, we put a toothpick in, and each species gets its own color-coded toothpick so we can follow who's germinating at what frequency across this gradient. And what we're planning to do as we get more of these data in is compare the elevation ranges where the seedlings can successfully germinate and establish to the elevation ranges of the adults in the resurveyed plots, so we can see if the slow rates of change of the adults are really driven by these time lags in mortality and colonization. Okay, now remember the other hypothesis for the slow rates of change and the lack of range shifts is that there's buffering by the microclimatic refugia. So the idea here is that these species in the understory aren't feeling the effects of climate change because they're in these nooks and crannies created by canopy and topography that mean that the climate they're experiencing has not changed that much. And they have these little refuges. And so if we go back to the seed addition experiment, we're also hoping to use this design to test this idea about buffering. So we've not just put the plots in one kind of habitat, but we've actually stratified them across a range of topographies. So we have them down in sheltered coves where there's likely to be some cold air pooling. And then we have them up on exposed ridges where the temperatures are warmer and more variable and then more exposed to regional climate change. And likewise, we have them sort of out in the open. And then we also have them under deep canopy where they'll be sheltered again in these putative micro refugia. So all of the seed addition plots are nested in all of these different microhabitat types. And the idea is that if we look again at seedling recruitment, where can the seeds germinate and establish and recruit into new plants? If we're in these buffered habitats, then there should not be a mismatch between the adults and the seedlings. So they're not feeling the climate change and the seedlings can establish everywhere the adults are. And the idea that the prediction here is that in the exposed habitats on the ridges, in the open areas without canopy shelter, that we might see that the seedlings are offset in their recruitment patterns from the adults because of this exposure to climate change interacting with time lags and mortality and limited recruitment. One more idea that I wanted to bring up here at the end is that these recruitment events, the colonization patterns, can be limited by opportunities. And it's not just opportunities for movement, but it's opportunities to sort of find an open spot free of competition. Likewise, the mortality that is slow to happen can often be kickstarted by big disturbance events, things like pest outbreaks, wind throw, fire. And so we've been really interested in whether fire and other disturbances like it can actually kickstart climate tracking by clearing out those time lags, clearing out the living dead, creating opportunities for recruitment, and then clearing out resident vegetation that might be blocking colonists from establishing in newly suitable, climatically suitable places, right? And so we know that fire is an important component of these forests, particularly on the east side. We know that it can have a big regenerative effect, and people have studied sort of typical successional processes driven by fire for many, many years. But what we're really talking about here is whether the fire can kickstart not just successional dynamics within the site with the traditional host of species, but actually create those opportunities for climate-driven range shifts to actually happen at a faster pace than in the absence of disturbance. And so if we look at the plots in the North Cascades, these are the resurvey plots going back to the Jim Agee study. And the plots that have never burned recently are shown in black X's. And the ones that are open circles have burned, and it's color coded as did they burn before the original vegetation survey? Or more interestingly for our purposes, did they burn between the two surveys, right? So what we have then are baseline data on vegetation composition from the 70s and 80s. And then we have plots that either did or didn't burn in between the two. And we can see if the burning has actually changed the effect of climate change and the rate of range shift compared to the unburned plots at the modern time. And so here are just some quick figures to suggest that, yeah, it really actually might be having a really big effect. So there are species that are known to be fire associates, so things like the snowbrush that can resprout after fire, it can have massive waves of recruitment after fire. And so when we look at what does its probability of presence do as a function of elevation, when those plots burned since the 80s, then we have a huge boost in snowbrush abundance. This is not surprising because it's known to be fire associated. But if we look at its range limits, its probability of presence and its peak abundance, it really is not changed across elevation by the fire. It just increases in abundance, okay? But on the other hand, if we look at these two species, these are quite interesting. So the black huckleberry and the kinnikinick have this really strong interaction between the elevation and whether the plot's burned or not. So if we look at the historical data, this is the range of the black huckleberry in the 70s and 80s. And now on the plots that did not burn and were resurveyed, its range is basically unchanged, excuse me. Range is basically unchanged. But when the plots burned, then we see that it kickstarted what looks like a pretty dramatic upslope migration. On the burned plots, it can colonize and recruit at higher elevations than it was ever observed in the historical data or in the resurveyed data that didn't burn. And a similar, the less dramatic thing is happening for kinnikinick. So compared to the historical data, it's showing a pretty dramatic upslope shift, but only when it burns. When the plots don't burn, then we see no change in its range, but a pretty dramatic decrease in prevalence. Okay. So it really does seem like the slow amount of range change can be accelerated pretty dramatically for these species that are sensitive to fire, kickstarting some pretty dramatic upslope range shifts that we don't see in the absence of fire. So I hope I've convinced you that climate-driven range shifts are not quite as simple as predicting that species that can't stand the heat are just going to leave the kitchen and go upslope. And there's quite a lot of complexity in trying to understand how these communities of individual species will shift on their own and then reassemble into different combinations of species that will look and probably function differently than the species assemblages we see today. I also hope that I've shown you that we can sort of tackle these complexities with observations and with experiments to try to figure out in particular whether the slow amount of change we see signals vulnerability. Is it worrisome because it means there's big time lags and our forests are really out of equilibrium with the current climate? Or does it signal that there's some degree of buffering? These species are actually protected by the nooks and crannies in the microhabitat that are causing them to not feel the perturbation of climate change quite as much as we would think. And so just to summarize, in these data, what we see in the North Cascades in particular is that although climate has changed, most plant ranges haven't shifted apace. And what we're doing is working to try to discover why and whether this is good news or bad news for the species in these forests. And I hope I've left enough time, yes, to take questions if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great presentation. Really interesting. So you have one question in the chat, and all the attendees who have questions, I ask you to just type them into the chat or the Q&A, either one, and I'll read those questions off to Dr. Angert, and she can answer them. So I'll start with the first one. Katie Mitchell is asking, mentioning that starflower, Trientalis latifolia, the overall probability was quite a lot lower than previously. Should we worry about species with patterns like this?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time worrying about that myself. Not that particular species so much as how much can we interpret changes, not just in elevational extent, but changes in prevalence. One of the trickiest things for these kinds of resurveys is matching the methods between historical and present day surveys. And in particular, what you really want to try to control for are differences in survey effort. So, and a lot of time that depends on the motivation for the survey. So in the historical data, the motivation for the historical studies was usually to try to map basic forest community types, mostly focusing on trees and sort of large emergent species. They really weren't concerned with the understory so much. When we resurveyed, we sort of geeked out and keyed everything out and ended up with about twice as many species on our species list and about twice as much species richness per plot as in the historical data. And so we've had to deal with that by with some statistical methods to account for that big boost in survey effort that we had compared to the historical time. And what that means is that when we see species that increase in prevalence, that could be a signal of survey effort. But when we see species that decrease in prevalence, despite our increased survey effort, then I do feel worried. I do feel like those are probably species of concern, and they might warrant some separate investigation to see what's happening with their population dynamics.
David Bartz asks if you've done any research on the availability of soil on the highest plants. The highest elevations do not have much soil, so there really isn't any place for the highest plants to migrate up to.
Yeah, that's a great point. We mostly stop at the subalpine, actually, again, because the motivation for these initial studies was to map the forest types. They're not getting up into the sort of true alpine and the scree and places where the soil development is that limited. But we do think about all the other things besides climate that could certainly be affecting species distributions. And we've taken soil samples from all of the plots where we've done the seed addition experiment to try to look into that. I don't have those data back yet, but yeah, we'll certainly explore that.
Yeah. Mark Turner is asking if 40 years is just too short a time to see these kind of changes.
I think for these long-lived species, it probably is, but I will say in most other data sets done over similar time spans, we see more change. So for example, in that Alps community, it's forest species surveyed over just about as much time in sort of similar kinds of habitats. And so this plant community really is sort of on the slow end, even for a typically slow sort of species assemblage. So I think something a little bit different happening here, even though surely with more time, we'll see more of these rare events, we'll see more mortality. But there's I think something a little bit different here that we haven't quite figured out.
Jeff Foster is asking if there are any differences in response between west side and east side elevational gradients. Do you see any difference on the east side of the mountains?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't think of any dramatic differences in the resurvey data, but we haven't parsed them at that level, so that might just be a lack of looking. In the seed addition experiment, we do see obviously different species recruiting preferentially on different sides of the mountain, and also a lot more early mortality on the dry side. So we had a lot of germination early on, and then they mostly all just kind of died from drought. So there's a lot slower but more sort of persistent recruitment happening on the west side. And it'll be interesting to see how that compares to where the adults are residing.
From Dan Dunphy, are there similar studies looking at climate change on plant communities at more northern and southern latitudes?
Sure, yeah, there's this resurveying, finding an old data set and resurveying has sort of turned into a cottage industry for ecologists. Everybody's sort of after those old data sets and trying to figure out if the methods were well documented enough that we could go back and do it. So there's a whole network of alpine resurveys. I think it's called the Gloria network. There's a lot of folks who've taken surveys done by museum or herbarium botanists who were taking collections and then archiving their notes so that people could come back and repeat the surveys in the future. There's a number in California and Colorado. Yeah, quite a few. The Alps, of course, they have amazing records in the Alps.
Fred Rhodes asking if you're counting all species of moss as a single species, or do you follow them individually?
I wish we could. So the original surveys just called them moss. They didn't identify them to species. So we also recorded moss as a functional type, but I don't analyze it because I'm sure there's a whole diversity of responses in there, but we can't tease them out because we didn't have a baseline sample that distinguished them by species.
News asking if you see any tree line shift in your data.
Well, our data wouldn't allow us to detect that because those initial surveys didn't go beyond the forest boundary at the time.
Right.
What we might be able to detect, though, is a signature of growth increase. So we are looking at juveniles and the diameters of the trees on the plots. And so if there's been an uptick in sort of growth and recruitment at the upper edge, we will be able to pick that up, but we don't have places that were totally untreed at the start to watch the encroachment.
Another question from Mark. With greater change in the Alps than in the Cascades over the same time period, is the difference in part due to our maritime climate?
Well, that would be interesting. That would be really interesting. I haven't done a detailed comparison of the climate space occupied by those two data sets. So that was part of our motivation by having the whole range of climate at Mount Rainier and especially on getting onto the east side for the North Cascades. So if there's some buffering from the maritime climate, I imagine we might see more change on that, say, east side of the Cascades than on the wetter sides of these mountain ranges. So we might be able to test that out. We're always looking for more data sets. So if somebody knew of a historical data set in the Olympics or other places around here where the communities have been protected enough that land use change and other things like that aren't confounded with climate change, that would be tremendous asset.
And Katrina and Abe are asking, how does our degree of climate variability compare with the Alps? We have PDO and so.
Right, that's true. So perhaps more cyclical change here. The absolute amount of warming has been similar. What I don't know is the change. One of the things I think is really important is the changing shift between precipitation as snow and precipitation as rain. and what that does to growing season length. And I know that's shifted a bit here. I don't know how much that's shifted there. But the amounts and rates of warming are actually fairly comparable.
Great. That's all the questions there now. Attendees, please continue to ask them. I'm kind of curious on how you might combine this data with other, you mentioned tree ring growth data. If you might be able to sort of look at this data and combine it with other data sets and get more insights that way. Are there particular types of data that you might look at?
Oh, Jim, there are some questions in the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Get back to
that. To answer your question, one thing that's sort of similar to the logic for the seed addition experiment is comparing the adult trees to the juveniles in the plots. So do we see changes in, growth increment of adults and or changes in the recruitment of juveniles that would signal changing composition? For example, we might see adults of one species, but we might see a sort of boost of recruitment of a different species that would signal sort of a long-term shift in composition that would be hard to detect just with the adults. So that's one sort of ancillary piece of data we're trying to pull in.
Great. Paul Brelier is asking if you compared other climatic variations besides temperature in this Puget Sound area, i.e. rain and snowpack.
Yeah, so there's been you have to kind of drill in. So if you look at total precipitation, it's just all over the place. There's no temporal trend in most of the sort of annual precipitation variables. But one thing that has shifted is with winter warming, we're seeing more of that wintertime precipitation is falling as rain instead of snow. And that has implications for sort of water storage and the sort of way that water is or isn't available all the way through the growing season. The snowpack will sort of melt out and trickle down into the soil at deeper layers, be more plant available than say rain that just runs off. And so it doesn't emerge that there's been a big change in the total amount of precipitation, but it's falling in different forms. And I think that makes it plant available in different ways. And so that's something that's a little bit more subtle, but I think an important part of the changing environment here.
Great. Catherine Fitch asks, where does the seed come from that you're using in your study?
So we did our very best to collect locally. So when we were out doing the resurveys, we would also collect fruits and seeds as we could find them maturing. We didn't always get enough, and so we also worked with some local native seed suppliers, trying to match at least the sort of seed zone and provenance, but we weren't able to, so as an evolutionary ecologist, I often think about local adaptation and the way, the genetic variation of this population might be better for this place as opposed to the genotypes that are in this other place, even though it's all the same species. They can be sort of fine-tuned to different elevations, say, and we weren't able to account for that level of sort of within species variation. We just sort of lumped what we could for a given species and put it in the mix. But yeah, they all came from as local as we could possibly find them.
Great. And Catherine Fitch is also asking if you've looked into the U.S. Forest Service forest inventory analysis data.
I have seen a lot of those. I have not worked with them myself, but yeah, that's an amazingly rich data set. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's it's a nationwide network of survey plots. They are on a mix of public and private land, but they get down to sort of the species identity, and they're resurveyed at not always regular intervals, but they come back, and so you can measure changes in growth and composition across the entire country. There's a sort of comparable data set in Canada, and so people can join those up and look at sort of most of North American tree community change over time. So yeah, that's, I've been focusing more on the understory species, the herbaceous layer and the shrubs, but for the emergent tree species, that's a pretty amazing data set. It shows a lot of change in time of our forest communities, but at that scale, there's a whole lot of factors that are driving that change, not just climate.
Anu Singhandi asks if mentions that some shifts may be caused by changes such as extirpation of competitors. Will you be able to tease out interspecies interactions?
Yeah, so we're just starting to tackle that. I actually have a new PhD student named Katie Goodwin, and she's really interested in the way that species interactions change along climatic gradients and whether they sort of can facilitate or hinder range shifts. And so she's focusing on one species of lupin because it has a whole bunch of interesting interactions. It depends on pollinators. It has a whole bunch of things that eat its leaves and its seeds. So she's going to be doing experiments where she does things like puts the seeds beyond the range limit, but protects them from seed predation versus leaves them alone, or she puts them out in a plot that's been cleared of vegetation and competitors, or a plot that is in the sort of background vegetation. And I'm really trying to tease apart how the direct effect of climate affects the ability to persist along an elevation gradient, but how that's modified by interactions with species that affect it either negatively or positively. So yeah, we don't have answers yet, but that's one of the enormous complexities. If you had to not just predict what a species' climatic tolerance was, but what the climatic tolerances of everything it interacted with, that's also changing. If we have to really forecast the interactions as opposed to just species by species by species, then it's the complexity increases by orders of magnitude, right? So the big question is, how much do the species interactions matter versus how much can we just study the direct effects of climate?
Yeah. Lyle Anderson is asking if you have any ideas how pollinators might be affecting the altitude adaptations of plants.
I don't. I want. Do you? Can I throw that back? I'd be really curious to know.
I don't. But I imagine you could do the exact same studies on the pollinator species themselves to see how they're shifting, right?
Sure, for sure. There's tons of resurveys of, oh gosh, butterflies and dragonflies and grasshoppers. There's a lot of insect resurveys, ground beetles, spiders, birds. Yeah, there's been resurveys, not just, I've focused on the plants, but there's accumulating evidence of range shifts for all sorts of different taxa, for sure.
So it would be a question I have then. So you're saying you have not seen much difference in shifts, but you mentioned these other studies. Are other studies seeing significant shifts in other places compared to here?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So there's been a sort of evolution of our thinking over time. I think in the early days, the very first resurveys, people were sort of, we didn't know how much climate change was affecting species ranges. And so you do the resurvey of the whole community and focus on the average. Yes, the average is going up. Most, more species are going up than down. Global warming is real. It's having biological effects, right? So the focus was sort of on that central tendency. But the more the data accumulated from more groups and more places, the more it became apparent, yes, it's true, climate change is happening. They're mostly moving upslope, but gosh, look at that spread, right? Like, what is that species doing going the wrong direction? And how does that one like so far out ahead of the curve, right? And so now we're really trying to understand the variation instead of that average. And so in all these groups, there is a lot of mobility, there's a lot of shift, there's some counterintuitive directions, and there's a bunch of species that aren't moving as much. So that seems to be sort of the whole package, and that's repeated over and over again. Oh, Jim, I can't hear you anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like we are out of questions unless I'm missing something in the chat or Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please type them now. Otherwise, we will sort of move to the informal portion of our meeting, which we do with local members and anyone else who wants to join us. We'll just sort of chat and socialize for a little bit.
Thank you so much for the great questions and coming. I appreciate it, guys.